Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today into something pretty interesting. I think it's pretty groundbreaking, actually. We're looking at Pakistan's draft green taxonomy.
Hmm.
Have you had a chance to look at this?
Yeah, I have, and it's quite a document.
It is a beast, right? It's
Yes,
a long document. So we're going to try to extract the, kind of the most important information, the most useful information
absolutely.
for folks. And the basic idea is that it's a way of understanding what green means in Pakistan,
Mm.
particularly for investments. So if you're looking to do green investing, this document is sort of like the cheat sheet.
It is. It's a guide for investors, policymakers, businesses. It's really trying to create that common language, that shared understanding of what counts as green.
And it's really interesting because it covers a wide range of sectors. It's not just, energy or something like that.
Right.
It's everything from manufacturing to transportation to energy, construction, waste, water,
Mm.
even things like ICT, tourism, agriculture, forestry.
It's very comprehensive.
Yeah. It really does try to lay out a vision for what a sustainable Pakistan would look like.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's a vision for the future.
So maybe we should start, like, why is Pakistan doing this?
Right, yeah.
What's the big picture here?
Yeah, well, Pakistan is actually ranked as the 8th most affected country by climate change, according to the Global Climate Risk Index.
Wow.
So this is a country that is already experiencing the impacts of climate change quite significantly,
Yeah.
whether it's floods or droughts, extreme events.
Right.
So it's really important for them to both attract investments that are going to help them build resilience, but also, make sure that development is happening in a way that is sustainable and doesn't exacerbate the problem.
It's almost like I mean, it's obviously not just about attracting foreign investment, although I'm sure that's a part of it,
Right.
but it's also about, making sure that development inside Pakistan is happening in a way that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And it provides that clarity, that transparency
Mm.
for everyone involved. So you know exactly what's considered green, what's not.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that jumps out at you when you look at this document is that, it's organized in this kind of traffic light system.
Yes.
Right?
Green, amber, red.
Green, amber, red. And that immediately, I think, helps to clarify things.
It does. It makes it very clear what activities are aligned with those climate goals, which ones need some work.
And which ones are, absolutely not acceptable.
Exactly.
So let's talk about some of the specific sectors. I mean, we obviously can't go through all of them, but maybe we could highlight a few of the key ones.
Sure.
Manufacturing, for instance.
Yeah, manufacturing is interesting.
I mean, Pakistan is trying to grow its manufacturing sector.
Right.
Obviously. I mean, that's a key part of economic development for any country. So how do they handle manufacturing?
Well, they get really specific. They use ISIC and PSIC codes.
Okay. What are those?
These are essentially codes that categorize different types of manufacturing activities, so very granular.
So it's not just saying, manufacturing good or bad. It's actually looking at each specific type of manufacturing.
Each activity, exactly.
Right.
And then laying out for each of those codes specific criteria for what makes that activity green, amber, or ineligible.
Can we look at a specific example? I
Yeah.
think that would help to clarify things.
Absolutely.
What jumps out at you as an interesting one?
Well, plastics.
Okay, plastics, always a hot button issue.
Yeah.
So how does the taxonomy treat plastics manufacturing?
Well, to be considered green, the plastics have to be made from renewable sources.
The plant-based materials.
Exactly. Things like that. And they can't be primarily for single-use products.
The biodegradable packaging would be fine.
Yes.
But a plastic water bottle, single use, not so much.
Not so much. That would fall under the ineligible category.
Okay, so they're really trying to move away from that.
Absolutely. Very clear signal there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, what about something that's, kind of in between?
The amber category.
Amber category, yeah. Where it's like, okay, we're not quite there yet, but we're working on it.
Right. And you see that with some of the, let's say, more traditional manufacturing industries.
Like cement, for example,
Cement is a great example.
which is, a huge part of the construction industry.
Exactly.
So how do they handle cement?
Well, if you're using certain technologies to reduce emissions, that would be considered amber because it's a step in the right direction.
Okay, it's progress.
It's progress, not perfection yet.
Yeah, but it's not, the end goal.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about manufacturing. What about another huge sector is transportation.
Absolutely.
And, Pakistan's rapidly growing. There's more and more cars on the roads all the time. How does the taxonomy address transportation?
Well, they acknowledge right up front that transportation accounts for a significant chunk of their emissions, cars and trucks being the major culprits there.
Hmm.
So they're really pushing for a shift towards more sustainable options like public transportation and this word that we're hearing more and more, micro-mobility.
Yeah, micromobility. What exactly does that mean?
Things like bikes, electric scooters, those kinds of
So
solutions.
smaller vehicles,
Smaller vehicles, more efficient, often electric.
and often shared as well.
Often shared, exactly. And they even consider the infrastructure needed to support this.
Like bike lanes?
Bike lanes, charging stations, that kind of thing. They're really thinking about the whole ecosystem.
So they're not just trying to make cars greener.
Right.
They're trying to think about how do we move people in a fundamentally different way.
That's a great way to put it, a systemic approach.
And I noticed that they have a whole category dedicated to micromobility,
They do.
like code T2 or something like that.
Yeah, T2, it just shows they're really tuned in to the global trends and how cities are evolving.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's really interesting about this taxonomy is that, it's clearly rooted in the Pakistani context,
Absolutely.
but it's also very forward-looking.
Uh-huh.
It's looking at, global best practices and saying, okay, how do we adapt those to our needs and really create a system that's going to work for us?
I think that's a key point. It's not just copying and pasting from other countries. It's really tailoring it to the local context.
So we've talked about manufacturing and transportation, but I mean, there's so much more in this document.
Oh, yeah, we've barely scratched the surface.
We haven't even talked about energy. We haven't talked about construction, waste management. I mean, the list goes on.
It's a deep dive, that's for sure.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
But I think we've laid a good foundation here. We've kind of set the stage for understanding what this taxonomy is all about
I agree.
and why Pakistan is doing it.
I think so too. So where should we go next?
Well, you mentioned construction earlier.
Yes.
And I have to admit, I don't usually think of construction as a, major contributor to climate change.
I think a lot of people don't. But actually, globally, buildings and construction account for a huge chunk of greenhouse gas emissions.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, the International Energy Agency, they say it's almost 40% globally.
Wow. Okay, so that's both the energy used to operate buildings and the emissions from actually producing the material.
Exactly. It's the whole life cycle.
So where does Pakistan's green taxonomy fit into all of this?
Well, they dedicate a whole section to green construction, and it's pretty detailed. They really emphasize using sustainable materials, designing buildings that are energy efficient, incorporating renewable energy sources. It's pretty comprehensive.
So paint me a picture. What would a green building in Pakistan look like, according to this taxonomy?
Okay, so let's say we're talking about a new building. They set specific energy consumption targets. New constructions need to be significantly more efficient than, the current standard. So think better insulation, more efficient heating and cooling systems, and of course, solar panels on the roof, things like that.
That makes sense. But what about, there's so many buildings that already exist
Right.
that probably aren't very energy efficient.
Yeah, and the taxonomy addresses that too for renovations. They encourage upgrades that are going to boost energy performance.
So like replacing old windows,
Mm,
maybe adding insulation.
exactly. And again, integrating renewable energy systems wherever possible.
It's really about a whole building life cycle approach.
It is. And they go even further by encouraging green building certifications, things like LED, the globally recognized standard.
Right.
And they even mention promoting Pakistan's own emerging certification system. So really trying to align with international best practices while also developing local solutions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, it's not just about energy efficiency, though, right?
No, they also stress water conservation in buildings.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Water-efficient fixtures, rainwater harvesting, systems for reusing gray water.
So trying to reduce the amount of water that's wasted.
Absolutely, making every drop count.
Okay, so we've talked about construction. Now, what about another big one? Waste management.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge, especially in a rapidly developing country like Pakistan.
Right.
And the taxonomy dives right in. They recognize that waste management is essential for both climate change mitigation and adaptation. So they call for reducing waste generation in the first place, boosting recycling rates, and developing sustainable waste treatment technologies.
So it's not just about collecting trash.
No, it's about a system overhaul.
It's about rethinking how we deal with waste.
Exactly. And they have separate categories for different types of waste.
Yeah.
from non-hazardous waste like paper and plastic to bio-waste like food scraps.
So for things like paper and plastic, what do they consider green?
Really robust collection, sorting, and recycling systems. They even lay out criteria for what they call material recovery facilities, essentially plants designed to process recyclable materials.
So it's all about moving towards that circular economy idea.
Absolutely. Waste is a resource.
Yeah, it's not just something to be thrown away.
Exactly. Now, for bio-waste, they advocate for composting
Okay.
and anaerobic digestion. That's a process that uses microorganisms to break down organic matter
Right.
and produce biogas, which can be used as fuel.
So you're actually turning waste into energy.
Exactly. Closing the loop.
And what about the waste that can't be recycled or composted?
That's where it gets a little trickier.
Yeah.
They acknowledge the role of waste-to-energy technologies, but they set a high bar for environmental performance.
So these facilities have to have high energy recovery rates. They have to minimize pollution.
Exactly. It's a balancing act.
Right.
Trying to manage waste effectively while minimizing the environmental impact.
It sounds like they've really thought this through, though.
They have. And they even encourage research and development in this area, looking for new solutions to reduce, recycle, and treat waste more sustainably.
Okay, so we've covered construction, we've covered waste. Now, what about the most fundamental resource of all, water?
Right, water. Pakistan faces major water challenges.
Absolutely, everything from scarcity to pollution.
Yeah. And the taxonomy addresses this head on. They recognize how interconnected water management is with climate change. And they emphasize things like efficient water use, improving infrastructure, and implementing nature-based solutions.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. What do they mean by improving water management?
Well, for one thing, reducing water consumption.
Okay, across the board, you mean. Not just in homes, but in industry, agriculture.
Everywhere. They also talk about upgrading existing water infrastructure, a lot of which is old and inefficient.
So making the entire system more efficient and less wasteful.
Exactly. But they don't stop there. They also advocate for nature-based solutions.
Like what?
Things like restoring wetlands and promoting what they call sustainable urban drainage systems.
Nature-based solutions, that sounds interesting. How does that work in practice?
Well, think about restoring wetlands, for example. Wetlands act as natural filters. They help control flooding. They provide habitat for wildlife. By protecting and restoring those ecosystems, we can make our water systems more resilient.
So it's about working with nature rather than against it.
Exactly. And those sustainable urban drainage systems I mentioned, those are all about managing stormwater runoff in cities in a more natural way. So imagine using permeable surfaces that allow water to soak into the ground instead of just running off into the sewers.
Okay.
Or incorporating more green spaces that can absorb and filter rainwater.
So mimicking natural processes.
Exactly, working with nature's design. And they even include criteria for improving sewage systems and wastewater treatment plants.
So it's really a holistic approach.
It is. They're thinking about the entire water cycle.
Yeah.
And they highlight how crucial water management is, not just for climate adaptation, but for the overall health of the environment and the economy.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. But before we move on, I'm curious, what about the digital world?
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, all the technology that we use, all the data centers, the internet, all of that has an environmental footprint.
Oh, absolutely.
So does this green taxonomy address that at all?
They do. They have a whole section on ICT.
ICT.
Information and communication technology. They recognize that data centers, network infrastructure, electronic devices, all of that has an impact.
So how do they propose to make that sector more sustainable?
Well, for data centers, they set criteria for energy efficiency, promoting renewable energy use, reducing energy consumption in the servers and cooling systems.
So trying to make those massive data farms that power the internet less energy hungry.
Exactly. And they also encourage using ICT to actually develop solutions that can help reduce emissions in other sectors.
So using data to optimize transportation network.
Right. Or to monitor energy consumption, things like that.
So technology can be part of the solution,
Absolutely.
not just part of the problem.
Right. And they also address the issue of electronic waste.
Oh, that's a huge issue.
It is, all those old phones and computers and everything. So they're pushing for safe disposal and recycling of those devices.
Okay, so it's about managing the entire life cycle of our electronics.
Exactly, from design to disposal.
Now, there's one more sector that I wanted to ask about, and it's one that I don't think people always connect with climate change, and that's tourism.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, so how does the green taxonomy handle tourism?
Well, they recognize that tourism has this complex relationship with the environment.
Right. It can be good for the economy,
Yeah.
but it can also put a strain on resources.
Exactly. So they really zero in on ecotourism, promoting practices that minimize the environmental footprint of tourism
Sure.
while also benefiting conservation efforts and local communities.
So think like eco lodges, nature tours, supporting local businesses.
Exactly, those kinds of things. And they provide specific guidelines for ecotourism investments, stressing the importance of assessing environmental impacts and taking steps to mitigate them.
So really trying to steer that sector towards a more sustainable path.
They are. And they also acknowledge that tourism itself is vulnerable to climate change impacts.
Right. Things like extreme weather events, rising sea levels.
Exactly. So they emphasize the importance of climate resilience in tourism development.
So making sure that those beautiful beaches and those incredible natural landscapes are still there for future generations to enjoy.
That's the idea, protecting those assets both for the sake of the environment and for the long-term viability of the tourism industry itself.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from construction to waste management to water to even tourism and technology.
It's a wide-ranging document.
It really is. And I think what's striking to me is just how much thought has gone into this. It's not just a list of green activities. It's a framework for thinking about sustainability across the entire economy.
I agree, it's a very holistic approach, and it's not static.
What do you mean?
Well, they built in mechanisms for review and updates. So as new technologies emerge,
Right.
as our understanding of climate change evolves, the taxonomy can adapt.
So it's a living document.
It is. It's a roadmap for a more sustainable future for Pakistan. And it's a fascinating example of how countries are grappling with this global challenge.
Right. So we're back, and we've spent the last couple of segments really digging into Pakistan's green taxonomy, looking at all these different sectors and how they define what green actually means. But now I think it's time to shift gears a little bit and talk about climate change adaptation. Because it's one thing to reduce emissions, but it's another thing to prepare for the impacts that are already happening.
Absolutely. And Pakistan is particularly vulnerable to climate change. So adaptation is a really crucial part of this taxonomy.
So we've talked about things like building more energy efficient buildings and developing sustainable transportation systems. But how does adaptation fit into all of this? What kind of measures does the taxonomy actually promote?
Well, it really depends on the sector. But they highlight several key areas, and they're all about building resilience, making sure that these systems can withstand the challenges of a changing climate.
Blah.
So, for example, in the water sector, there's a huge emphasis on efficient water use, restoring wetlands, developing those sustainable urban drainage systems that we talked about earlier.
Right, so those nature-based solutions play a role in adaptation as well. It's not just about, building seawalls or something like that.
Exactly. It's about working with nature, enhancing natural systems to make them more resilient.
And what about transportation? I mean, we talk about, moving towards more sustainable modes of transport, but how do you adapt a transportation system to climate change?
Well, a lot of it has to do with infrastructure. Making sure that roads, bridges, airports, all of that can withstand extreme weather events. They also talk about things like developing early warning systems and disaster preparedness plans. So it's about being prepared for those shocks.
So it's not just about, building a stronger bridge. It's also about knowing when a storm is coming.
Exactly. And having systems in place to respond effectively.
And what about construction? I mean, obviously, buildings are vulnerable to things like floods and heat waves.
Absolutely. So the taxonomy emphasizes building an infrastructure that can withstand those kinds of extreme events. Stronger buildings, maybe using different materials, designing structures that can better cope with heat or flooding. It's about future-proofing our cities and towns.
Right, because those buildings are going to be around for a long time.
Exactly. And they also highlight the importance of disaster risk management more broadly, strengthening emergency response systems, implementing risk reduction measures. It's really a multifaceted approach.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of specific measures, but there's one thing that I keep seeing throughout this document, and I'm curious to get your take on it. They keep mentioning this principle of do no significant harm, or DNSH. What exactly does that mean, and why is it so important?
That's a really crucial principle, and it's all about making sure that the solutions we're putting in place to address climate change don't create new problems in other areas. So an activity might be considered green in terms of its climate impact, but it might have negative consequences for biodiversity or water resources, for example.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture, making sure that we're not just shifting the problem around.
Exactly. It's about taking a holistic view of sustainability. And the taxonomy includes specific DNSH criteria for different sectors. So, for instance, a project that promotes renewable energy but destroys a critical habitat for endangered species, that wouldn't be considered truly green under the DNSH principle.
Right, so it's not just about checking boxes. It's about really thinking through the implications of our actions.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the things that's really impressive about this taxonomy. They've really tried to think about sustainability in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, I mean, we've just scratched the surface here, but it's clear that Pakistan is taking this very seriously. They're not just paying lip service to sustainability, they're actually putting in the work to create a framework that can guide their development for years to come.
I completely agree. It's an ambitious undertaking, and it's not going to be easy to implement, but I think it has the potential to be a real game changer, not just for Pakistan, but potentially for other countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to see how this plays out. Will other countries follow suit? Will this become a model for green taxonomies around the world? These are all questions that, I think we're going to be grappling with in the years to come. But for now, I think we've done a pretty good job of unpacking this document. We've explored the key sectors, we've talked about mitigation and adaptation, we've even touched on those overarching principles like do no significant harm. So I want to thank you for joining me on this deep dive, and I want to encourage our listeners to check out the taxonomy for themselves. It's a fascinating read, and it really gives you a glimpse into the future of sustainable development.
It does, and I think it's a future worth exploring.